Story 1. The first night in our dorm room felt like the start of something big, the kind of nervous excitement you get before a high school play or a first date. Mike, my roommate, was already unpacking, his movements efficient and quiet. He'd claimed the bottom bunk without a word, leaving me the climb to the top. I didn't mind. I'd always liked the feeling of being a little removed. The room itself was standard issue, 2 narrow beds, 2 desks shoved against opposite walls, and a shared, beat-up dresser. The linoleum floor was a depressing shade of beige, and the cinderblock walls echoed with the sounds of other students settling in. But for that first evening, it felt like hours, a blank canvas. Mike was a bit of an enigma. He was polite but reserved, his answers to my attempts at conversation short and to the point. He had these intense, dark eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and a habit of looking just past you when he spoke. I chalked it up to first day jitters and figured he'd open up once we got to know each other better. The first few weeks passed in a blur of orientation meetings, awkward icebreakers, and the frantic scramble to find our way around campus. Mike and I fell into a comfortable, if somewhat distant, routine. He was a meticulous student, always in the library, his side of the room impeccably organized. I was more easygoing, my desk usually buried under a chaotic landscape of textbooks and half-eaten snacks. It started subtly. A feeling of being watched when I was alone in the room, even though I knew Mike was at his study group. A faint scratching sound coming from the ceiling above my bunk, like tiny claws skittering across the plaster. I'd sit up in bed, straining my ears, but it would always stop as soon as I focused on it. I dismissed it as the old building settling or maybe even mice. Then came the dreams. Vivid, unsettling nightmares where I was trapped in a small, dark space, the air thick and heavy, a presence just out of sight breathing down my neck. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the lingering feeling of dread clinging to me like a shroud. One morning, I woke up to find 3 deep scratches etched into the wooden frame at the head of my bunk. They looked fresh, like they'd been made recently. I ran my fingers over them, a shiver crawling down my spine. Mike was already gone to class. I stared at the marks, trying to rationalize them. Maybe the wood was old and cracked easily? But these looked deliberate. I started sleeping less, the fear of the dreams bleeding into my waking hours. The scratching intensified, sometimes happening in the middle of the day when I was trying to study. I even heard a faint whispering once, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from directly above me. I finally decided to talk to Mike. He was sitting at his desk, bathed in the pale afternoon light, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read. Mike, I began hesitantly. Have you heard anything weird at night? Like scratching? He looked up, his dark eyes meeting mine for a fleeting moment before flicking away. Scratching? No, I haven't noticed anything. His tone was flat, dismissive. And have you seen these? I pointed to the scratches on my bunk. He glanced up briefly. Looks like old damage. He turned back to his book. His reaction, or lack thereof, unnerved me more than the scratching itself. Was he really not hearing or seeing anything, or was he just pretending? The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I would catch glimpses of movement in the periphery of my vision, a shadow flickering in the corner of the room when I knew I was alone. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night and feel a cold spot in the air above me, as if something was hovering there. One night, the scratching was relentless. It was accompanied by a low, rhythmic thumping, like something was hitting the underside of my mattress. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. Mike? I whispered into the darkness. Are you awake? Silence. I reached for my phone, the screen illuminating my trembling hand. The time was 3:17 a.m. I considered calling campus security, but what would I even say? There's scratching in my ceiling? They'd think I was crazy. Gathering my courage, I slowly swung my legs over the side of the bunk. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I stood. I stared up at the underside of my mattress, the darkness seeming to writhe and shift. Suddenly, the thumping stopped, and the scratching intensified, closer now, right above my head. And then, I heard it again, the whispering. This time, it was clearer, a sibilant murmur that sounded like my name. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through me. I backed away from the bunk, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. "Come up here." I stumbled backward, hitting my desk, knocking over a pile of books. The noise seemed to startle whatever was above me. The scratching stopped abruptly, and the whispering ceased. I didn't sleep in that room again. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the common room, the harsh fluorescent lights a small comfort against the terror that clung to me. The next morning, I went straight to the resident advisor. I told him everything, the scratching, the whispering, the feeling of being watched. He listened patiently, his expression a mixture of concern and skepticism. He promised to have maintenance check the ceiling. Maintenance found nothing. No evidence of animals, no structural issues. They shrugged and said old buildings made strange noises. I asked for a room change. I couldn't stay there, not after what I'd heard. The RA, though sympathetic, said it would take time. The dorms were full. That night, I slept on a friend's couch. The next day, I avoided our room altogether, spending my time in the library or the cafeteria. But I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. My books, my clothes, my life were there. I finally went back late in the afternoon, dread pooling in my stomach. Mike was there, sitting on his bed, polishing his shoes with an unnerving intensity. "They didn't find anything," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He looked up, his eyes strangely vacant. "I told you. It was nothing." I couldn't meet his gaze. I went to my desk, trying to focus on my textbook, but the memory of the whispering was too vivid, too real. As the evening wore on, the familiar scratching started again, faint at first, then growing louder. I flinched, my body tensing. Mike didn't react. "Don't you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. He continued to polish his shoes, his movements slow and deliberate. "Hear what?" I stared at him, a cold suspicion dawning in my mind. He had to hear it. It was so loud now, a frantic, desperate scratching, like something was trying to claw its way through the ceiling. Suddenly, Mike stopped polishing his shoes. He looked up at me, a slow, unsettling smile spreading across his face. His eyes, usually so dark, seemed to gleam with an unnatural light. "Maybe," he said, his voice low and raspy, "it just wants to be closer to you." The scratching intensified, directly above my head. The plaster on the ceiling began to crack. Dust rained down on me. Something was coming down. Something that had been sharing our room all along, hidden just above me, waiting. And Mike had known. All along, Mike had known. Story 2. The deadbolt clicked, a small, decisive sound that echoed in the sudden silence of my apartment. I stood frozen just inside the doorway, my hand still on the knob, a grocery bag heavy in my other arm. I knew, instantly, that something was wrong. My apartment was small, a one-bedroom above a dusty antique shop. I lived alone and was usually greeted by the comforting clutter of my books and the faint scent of lavender from the diffuser I always left running. But now, there was a stillness, an unnatural order that sent a shiver of unease down my spine. The air was different too, heavier, colder. It smelled faintly of dust and something else. Something metallic. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. Silence. My heart began to pound in my chest. I slowly stepped further into the apartment, my senses on high alert. The living room was neat, too neat. The throw pillows on the couch were perfectly aligned, the books on the shelf stood in rigid rows. It was as if someone had been here and tried to make it look untouched, but had failed in the small, unsettling details. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. I froze again, my breath catching in my throat. I wasn't alone. I dropped the grocery bag with a loud thud, the sound amplified in the oppressive silence. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the doorway to the hallway. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound assertive. No answer. Adrenaline surged through me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Had I left the door unlocked? I was usually so careful. I edged towards the kitchen, my hand reaching for the heavy cast iron skillet hanging on the wall. It felt cold and solid in my grip, a small comfort in the face of the unknown. The hallway was dark, the only light filtering in from the living room window casting long, distorted shadows. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and loud in my ears. "I'm calling the police," I said, hoping my voice carried a conviction I didn't feel. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, my fingers clumsy with fear. Just as my fingers brushed against the cool metal of my phone, a figure emerged from the shadows at the end of the hallway. Tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the dim light, it moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was both unsettling and predatory. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and intent. Fear paralyzed me for a moment. Then, instinct took over. I raised the skillet, my arm shaking, and took a step forward. "Stay back!" I yelled, my voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. It continued to advance, its movements silent and relentless. I swung the skillet, the heavy iron connecting with a sickening thud against something solid. The figure stumbled back, a low groan escaping its lips. This gave me the opening I needed. I turned and ran, scrambling back towards the front door. I fumbled with the deadbolt, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip the metal. Finally, it turned, and I yanked the door open, bursting out into the relative safety of the hallway. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the stairs, my lungs burning, my heart pounding like a drum against my ribs. I ran out onto the street, the cool night air a welcome relief against my sweat-soaked skin. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I finally stopped in front of a brightly lit convenience store, gasping for breath. My hands were still trembling, and the image of the figure in my hallway was burned into my mind. I called the police, my voice shaking as I recounted what had happened. They arrived quickly, sirens wailing, the flashing lights painting the street in stark red and blue. 2 officers accompanied me back to my apartment. They moved cautiously, their guns drawn, their expressions grim. The apartment was just as I had left it, except for a dark stain on the hallway wall where the skillet had connected. There was no sign of the intruder. No forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The police searched the apartment thoroughly, but they found nothing to indicate how someone had gotten in or where they had gone. They asked me repeatedly if I was sure I had locked the door. I was certain. They filed a report, their expressions skeptical. They suggested I might have imagined it, that stress could play tricks on the mind. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. I couldn't bring myself to stay in the apartment that night. A friend offered me her couch, and I gratefully accepted. Sleep didn't come easily. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking figure, every creak of the floorboard sent a jolt of fear through me. The next day, I went back to the apartment with the police. They conducted another search, this time more detailed. Still nothing. I changed the locks, installed a security system, and asked my landlord to put bars on the windows. But even with these precautions, the feeling of unease lingered. I couldn't shake the image of that gaunt figure in my hallway, the cold, intent eyes I couldn't see but knew were there. Weeks turned into months. Life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the memory of that night remained, a dark shadow lurking in the corners of my mind. I would often find myself checking the locks multiple times, jumping at sudden noises, the sense of security I had once felt in my own home shattered. Then, one rainy afternoon, I was cleaning out a dusty corner of my closet when I found it. Tucked away behind a stack of old sweaters was a small, antique key. It wasn't mine. I didn't recognize it. It was old and tarnished, with intricate carvings on its handle. A cold dread washed over me. I didn't know where it came from, but I had a terrible feeling that this key held the answer to what had happened that night. Had someone had a key to my apartment all along? I took the key to the police. They examined it, but it didn't match the new locks I had installed. They ran it through their database, but it came up with nothing. I was left with the unsettling realization that someone had been in my home, someone I didn't know, someone who had a way in. And the mystery of who they were and how they had disappeared remained unsolved, a constant source of anxiety and fear. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled outside my window, I would imagine the figure in my hallway, its silent, relentless advance. And I would clutch the antique key in my hand, a cold, tangible reminder of the night my sense of safety was stolen, the night I became the unexpected guest in my own home. Story 3. Moving into the old Victorian house off campus had seemed like a great idea at the time. It was cheap, spacious, and had a certain Gothic charm that appealed to my roommate, Sarah, and me. We were on the top floor, in a sprawling attic space that had been converted into a makeshift apartment. It had slanted ceilings, dusty dormer windows, and a creaky staircase that led down to the main house. The landlord, a reclusive old woman named Mrs. Gable, lived on the first floor. We rarely saw her, and when we did, she was always shrouded in shadows, her face a blur of wrinkles and suspicion. She had one rule: never go down to the basement. She never explained why, and we never asked. Some doors are best left unopened. Sarah was an art student, vibrant and outgoing, always covered in paint and full of crazy ideas. I was more reserved, a literature major who preferred the company of books to large crowds. We were an unlikely pair, but we got along well enough, our different personalities somehow balancing each other out. The attic apartment had 2 bedrooms, a small shared living space, and a tiny bathroom. It was drafty and prone to strange noises, the wind whistling through the eaves, the house settling with loud groans, the occasional scurrying in the walls that we tried to ignore. But after a few weeks, the noises started to change. They became more distinct, more deliberate. We would hear footsteps above us, heavy and slow, pacing back and forth. But there was no floor above us, just the slanted roof. "Did you hear that?" Sarah would ask, her eyes wide. "Yeah," I'd reply, trying to sound nonchalant. "Just the old house." But we both knew it wasn't just the house. These footsteps were too regular, too rhythmic. And they always seemed to happen late at night, after we had gone to bed. One night, the pacing was accompanied by a dragging sound, like something heavy was being pulled across the floor. It went on for what felt like hours, keeping us both awake, our nerves frayed. "Maybe Mrs. Gable has someone staying with her?" Sarah suggested, her voice laced with doubt. But the footsteps were directly above us. There was no one else living on our floor. We started to hear other things too. Soft whispers that seemed to come from the walls, a faint scratching sound that reminded me of fingernails on wood, and sometimes, a low, mournful humming that sent chills down our spines. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind playing tricks on the old house. Maybe it was the pipes. Maybe we were just letting our imaginations run wild. But the feeling of unease grew stronger with each passing night. We started sleeping with the lights on, jumping at every creak and groan. One evening, Sarah found something tucked under her bedroom door. It was a small, intricately folded piece of paper. When she opened it, there was a single word written in a spidery, unfamiliar hand. Leave. Fear finally gave way to a sense of urgency. We had to figure out what was going on. We decided to try and talk to Mrs. Gable. We found her in the dimly lit hallway on the first floor, her silhouette framed against the gloom. Mrs. Gable, Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly, we've been hearing some strange noises upstairs. Footsteps, dragging sounds. Mrs. Gable's head snapped up, her eyes, dark and sunken, fixing on us with an intensity that made me flinch. Her face, usually hidden in shadow, was gaunt and pale, her lips a thin, bloodless line. Noises? She croaked, her voice raspy, like dry leaves rustling. There are no noises. But we hear them every night, I interjected, trying to sound calmer than I felt. And Sarah found this under her door. I held out the folded piece of paper. Mrs. Gable's eyes narrowed as she looked at the note. A tremor ran through her hand as she reached for it. She unfolded it slowly, her gaze fixed on the single word. A strange expression flickered across her face, a mixture of fear and something that looked like recognition. She clutched the note to her chest, her knuckles white. You must ignore them, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It's just the house settling. Old houses make noises. But the note. Sarah pressed. Mrs. Gable's eyes darted around the hallway as if she were afraid of being overheard. Go back upstairs, she said, her voice firmer now. Leave it be. It's nothing that concerns you. She turned and retreated into the shadows of her apartment, leaving us standing in the dimly lit hallway, more confused and unnerved than before. Her reaction only intensified our fear. We knew she wasn't telling us the truth. Something was going on in this house, something she didn't want us to know. That night, the noises were worse than ever. The pacing above us was frantic, the dragging sound more insistent. The whispers seemed to come from right outside our bedroom doors, just beyond the thin wood. And then, we heard a new sound, a soft, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat coming from the ceiling. We huddled together in Sarah's bed, the single lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the slanted walls. We held our breath, listening, our hearts pounding in unison with the unseen thumping above us. We have to get out of here, Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. But where would we go? I replied, feeling a sense of helplessness wash over me. We were broke college students, with nowhere else to go. As if in response to our despair, the thumping grew louder, more insistent. The ceiling above us began to vibrate. Dust rained down on our faces. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, and a section of the ceiling above Sarah's bed splintered and fell, revealing a dark, gaping hole. We screamed, scrambling back against the wall. We stared up at the hole, our eyes wide with terror. Something was looking down at us. I couldn't make out any features in the darkness, but I could feel its presence, cold and malevolent. I could hear its breathing, a slow, ragged rasp that echoed in the small room. Then, a hand reached down through the hole. It was pale and thin, the fingers long and skeletal, the fingernails yellowed and cracked. It moved slowly, deliberately, reaching towards Sarah. Sarah screamed again, burying her face in her hands. I grabbed a heavy textbook from the nightstand and threw it at the hand. It connected with a sickening thud, and the hand recoiled. We didn't wait. We scrambled out of bed and ran towards the door, the sound of something heavy shifting above us spurring us on. We burst out of the attic apartment and down the creaking stairs, our bare feet pounding on the wood. We didn't stop until we were out on the street, the cool night air a welcome relief against our terror-stricken faces. We didn't look back. We ran until we reached the safety of the brightly lit campus, our breath coming in ragged gasps. We spent the rest of the night in the common room of our old dorm, huddled together, trying to make sense of what had happened. We called the campus police, who listened to our story with a mixture of concern and disbelief. The next morning, accompanied by a campus security officer, we went back to the Victorian house to collect our belongings. Mrs. Gable wasn't there. The front door was slightly ajar, and the house felt cold and empty. The security officer went upstairs with us. The attic apartment was just as we had left it, except for the gaping hole in the ceiling above Sarah's bed. He shone his flashlight up into the darkness, but saw nothing. He made a cursory search of the rest of the apartment, but found nothing out of the ordinary. He suggested that the ceiling had simply collapsed due to age and that the noises we had heard were probably just the old house settling. He couldn't explain the note. We packed our things quickly, our movements jerky and hurried. We didn't want to linger in that place any longer than necessary. As we were leaving, I noticed a small, wooden door in the hallway that we had never seen before. It was tucked away in a dark corner, almost hidden by a grandfather clock. Curiosity and a morbid sense of dread compelled me to take a closer look. The door was old and warped, with no handle. It looked like it had been sealed shut for a long time. There was a faint scratching sound coming from behind it. "What's that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I hesitated for a moment, a cold premonition gripping me. Against my better judgment, I pushed against the door. It creaked open with a groan, revealing a narrow, dark staircase leading down. The scratching sound grew louder. And then, I heard it, the low, mournful humming we had heard in our apartment. It was coming from below. I took a step down, drawn by a morbid curiosity. Sarah grabbed my arm, trying to pull me back. "Don't," she pleaded, her voice filled with terror. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I descended a few steps, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. The humming grew louder, closer. And then, I saw it. In the dim light filtering down the stairs, I saw a figure huddled at the bottom. It was small and hunched over, its back to me. Its limbs were thin and twisted, its skin pale and translucent. Long, skeletal fingers scratched at the stone floor. And then, it turned its head. Its face was gaunt and withered, its eyes large and black, filled with an ancient sorrow. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, and the humming intensified, a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish. I stumbled backward, a scream caught in my throat. I didn't need to see any more. I knew what had been above us, what had been trying to reach us. I turned and fled, scrambling back up the stairs, Sarah's terrified face the last thing I saw before I burst out of the hidden doorway and slammed it shut. We never went back to the Victorian house. We lost our security deposit, but it was a small price to pay for our sanity. We moved back into the crowded dorms, grateful for the noise and the constant presence of other people. We tried to tell the police what we had seen, but they dismissed it as a hallucination, the product of stress and an overactive imagination. But we knew what we had experienced was real. We knew there was something in that old house, something trapped and malevolent, something that had been trying to get to us from the room upstairs, a room that shouldn't have existed. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear that low, mournful humming in my dreams, a chilling reminder of the roommate we never knew we had.